Sounds like many of us have exams coming up this week. I'd imagine there's a lot of professors trying to cram in exams and other stuff before break. So, best of luck as you wrap up the week and get ready to enjoy the extended holiday for Thanksgiving. So today is our last day working together as a full class, because while I will be here and able to help you out on Friday, you don't need to come to class if you aren't available or just need the time to focus on other stuff. So I'll be here to give you space to work or to directly answer your questions, or if you'd like to show me your document as you're working on it for feedback, I'm happy to do that. I've received several rough drafts or outlines, and I should have feedback on all of those to you by now, for those of you that already sent them. If you still want to send draft or outline, you're welcome to do that by the end of the day today, so that I can turn that around for you. You can turn it in afterwards, but I can't guarantee that I'll get feedback in time. Yeah, underneath.
What does by the end of the day mean?
11:59.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I'll have kind of a big chunk tomorrow where I'll be able to look at stuff. So if you send it late in the day today, I should be able to get that to you tomorrow.
Perfect.
Yeah, of course. So again, best of luck as you're continuing to work. Does anybody else need a copy of that sheet of paper I had for citations? Yeah, a couple of you. So last week, I was sending along just some examples of how you can cite in APA, MLA, and Chicago. So you're welcome to use this as a reference as you're citing. Yeah. So as far as the essay goes, does anybody have any other questions or things that I can do to help? Yes?
So if you're using footnotes and you're putting the number after every time you're signing something, it's like a new number for every quote. Like if you have 6 quotes and you have 6 numbers, it's not just a new number for each source.
Right. So under Chicago, Chicago has the IVID, however you pronounce that, where if you're citing the same source back to back, you can just use that instead of listing it out each time. Another thing you can do is if you're citing from specific page numbers or parts, then each citation would be a different part. So if you're citing from page 160 versus 165, that could be the different citation.
So you'd do either 165 or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you have, so that goes on your works cited page?
Yes.
Okay, so I would put the first time I use that source, I would put the Chicago format, and then if I use that again for the second quote, I would just put IVID for number 2.
Yes.
Do I need to put IVID number 2 or just IVID?
Just IVID because it'll already have been numbered out for you.
Okay.
Source number 2 is from the textbook. Source number 3 is also from the textbook. So I know when I'm looking at number 3, it's IVID, it's the same as what you had for number 2. Yeah, so that's a good question. In Chicago style, each time you're citing or referencing, you want to include that in, rather than just doing a 1 and a 2, and then quoting and citing from it over and over again without referencing back to it. Yeah, it's a good question, Hayden. Anything else? If you're concerned about your citations, I'm happy to give that a look to help you out too. Again, I know that can be a challenge to get citations locked in. So remember that late penalty is -5% for each day something is late. I'd much rather have a late assignment than an assignment that doesn't cite sources or include the stuff that it needs. So you can still get a good grade if you end up needing to turn it in a day late or two. So you can make that calculation for yourself based on how progress goes as to whether or not that's a better option for you. So again, I'm sure some other last minute questions might come up. I'll do my best to answer those. So please reach out if you would like some additional help there. So we've got that essay coming up. Again, I've been really impressed with the drafts that I've seen so far. Seems like people are really going in a good direction. Some of the feedback that I've given, I really encourage people in terms of quoting and citing from the theories or concepts that they're using in the class, to do that and get into the details, right? So for instance, don't just talk about uncertainty reduction theory. You can break that down into understanding things like behavioral and cognitive uncertainty. Once you've done that, and once you've done that work in explaining the text, you can directly apply and say, we can see behavioral and cognitive uncertainty at play here. I've noticed that when folks might have challenges with filling in the space of the essay, it's because there's more in the theories or concepts or ideas that they can be looking into more. If you're talking about nonverbal communication, you can think about both types, things like proxemics, haptics, and so on, but also the functions that it serves. Is it substituting or filling in for language? Is it adding to language? Is it contradicting language? Those like details within the broader topics that you've chosen, if you uncover those, that gives you more to work with in your analysis itself. So that's just something that's generally come up in the feedback that I've been able to give so far on the rough drafts. So make sure to cite, and quoting or paraphrasing, 2 to 3 body points are meant to separate out your key ideas. And then about 4 pages, double-spaced, works cited. Remember that you should cite both from the show or the film, and also make sure to cite from the Wrench textbook when you're including that. Outside of that, you shouldn't need any other citations since you're drawing mainly from that stuff in the class. So what I want to do today is build on relationships in communication and some of the ways that interpersonal communication helps us to manage and understand our relationships, which will help you going into this week as you're finishing up your essay. Can apply and use some of these ideas we've talked about today, and it'll especially help you in that final recording and reflection essay. I had a couple questions come up about the final essay in the class, so that's not due until mid-December. I'm going to spend a lot more time right after the break talking through that in a little bit more detail, but just to remind you about this one, the final essay in the class, I'm asking you to record a conversation with somebody else. It doesn't need to be a video recording. You can just record the audio. And then after that, you would be transcribing or writing the dialogue down on your own using the recording. So you might listen to it and say, okay, I said this, my dad said this, and then so on. I'll be posting an example on Canvas as well that shows you how to transcribe and have that dialogue be used. And then from that recorded dialogue, you'll kind of analyze and make sense of how you communicate, how to you engage with that other person. So that's kind of coming up in mid-December. We're doing that instead of a big cumulative final exam. So hopefully that's a fun and interesting way for you to use the stuff that we've been talking about in the back half of class. Also remember that the extra credit is available and is going to be due on December 10th. So we talked a little bit last class about how we maintain relationships. Again, we kind of broke down these strategies, but these were just a couple things that I went over kind of quickly last class. We just wanted to dedicate a little bit more time to before we get into the new stuff, right? So last class we talked about the different functions and purposes of relationships. For instance, things like duration, things like exchange theory that suggests that we use relationships in order to get positive benefits while avoiding negative outcomes. So we manage and maintain relationships kind of the same way that you are like repainting. So if there are like cracks or discoloration in a wall, right, you would typically paint over that or fix that up. In the same way, we fix up and manage our relationships through things like positivity. Through exchange theory, a relationship is seen as better or more meaningful if it's positive. We feel good. Openness, of course, is really important, especially going into social penetration theory and the idea that as relationships develop, we share more and more personal details. Assurances might be saying things like, hey, you got this, you're doing well, right? If you're like me and you like to watch silly holiday Hallmark, Netflix style, like holiday romantic comedies. There's one that I saw called Love Hard where it has the like classic best friend character that fails the Bechdel test and is just like constantly reassuring and cheering on the main character, like, oh, they're so into you, you've got this, right? That'd be an example of assurances from a character that doesn't ever really develop in these things. Networking is also a key idea. Right, so my mom loves to send me golden retriever photos on Instagram. We use things like social networking and media to connect others, sharing tasks. So if you and a friend, right, are working on moving somebody into a new home, doing those things together can help that relationship build. Depending on the friendship and the person, we might use tasks a lot for our relationships. Conflict management is not about ending a conflict when it happens, but helping us to better understand and engage in conflict with each other. So I talked about this in my conflict management class, but conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. It helps clear the air and helps us understand where we're coming from. So managing conflicts effectively, right? You could fight and argue all the time, but if you feel like you're better for it and you better understand each other, conflict can be a force for good. And advice, when it's wanted and when it's needed, can be great too, providing support for the other person and navigating their challenges. So again, it's like painting over or fixing up a house. So we use these types of strategies to maintain our relationships. We could avoid the relationship entirely, right? That's sort of toward the back half of those 10 relationship stages where we're avoiding and not dealing with the problem. We can also choose to keep balance and equity in the relationship. We feel good about our friendships with other people when we feel like both sides are able to gain or feel included. And we can use some direct strategies. So for instance, maybe you say, you know what, my good friend was really anxious about the midterm exam, and I was a little preoccupied, so let me spend some time talking to you. So we might use a very direct way to say that we care about somebody else and really try to maintain the balance, right? A good relationship, according to uncertainty reduction theory, isn't necessarily totally even every conversation. Somebody could talk a lot more or share a lot more on any given day, but the idea that the seesaw turns the other direction and the relationship feels even overall is something that a lot of us really care about. So moving on to some of the newer things that I want to get at. I want to get at the central idea that our relationships are defined in terms of contradiction, right? So for this class, we'll be talking about these types of contradictory issues and also looking at some contemporary applications in relationships where these types of contradictions are at play. So pictured here is Leslie Baxter, a professor at the University of Iowa, and the kind of person that spearheaded the concept of relational dialectics. So a dialectic, if we think back to the ancient Greeks, and the word di, meaning two, refers to the idea that our relationships with other people are these two different things that are in tension with each other, right? They're contradictions or two extremes that we're constantly needing to navigate. For instance, the feeling of being ourselves and being independent, but also feeling the need to be close with other people. So we're constantly juggling or walking these kinds of tightropes in our relationships. So I think Dr. Baxter has a really good example and application. I wanted to show you a brief clip that helps us to understand what relational dialectics is and how it can account for the ways that our relationships are constantly changing through the process of communication.
I am talking with Leslie Baxter from the University of Iowa. Leslie, along with Barbara Montgomery, has crafted the theory of relational dialectics. Leslie, what's the gist of relational dialectics?
The gist, is to recognize that all communication is the interplay of differences. And so I'd say differences is really the seed of the matter. And it's the interplay of those differences. And they're often competing and they're often oppositional. That's probably the heart of it.
Could you give an example of such a moment, maybe from your own life?
Don Braithwaite and I, a few years back, published what to this day is my favorite study, in which we went and interviewed people who'd been married for 50 years, who had elected to renew their marriage vows. And what we realized is that that was a ritual, and now I want to label that as an aesthetic moment. And when we talked to people about that, it was just a lovely exemplar of the sort of seamlessness of these differences sort of coming together, the differences are there, and the differences enable the sort of sense of wholeness in the ceremony. So in this one moment, they would say what was so nice about this renewal of marriage vows is when they uttered those words. It was to celebrate the fact that their marriage was the same as it was the day they got married. They loved each other the same. In fact, they even brought, the same wedding dress, the same tuxedo. Of course, they had to have them enlarged, but it was the same. And then a few minutes later, they'd be talking about how the ceremony was an opportunity for them to celebrate that their marriage wasn't the same as it was 50 years ago, that they had grown together, that now the meaning that they attributed to those words and the vow very different from what it meant 50 years ago. And so it was a lovely moment where, as all rituals are, they're meaningful, where you've got two oppositions. In this case, the sense that our marriage is the same and then our marriage is different.
So I think this is a really sweet example because, right, it deals with the idea that, as she mentioned, renewing marriage vows later in life, you have this combination of feelings. The relationship is very much the same. You're still very much in love. You very much care about other people, right? But there are so many differences in the ways that your lives have changed, evolved, and grown. A lot of times, right, these humans value predictability, stability, security, but at the same time, we also know that we change, we develop, we grow, our circumstances, our situations change. So our relationships change with those. And communication is the way by which our relationships evolve and change over time. We grow, or our relationships fall apart through communication. So contradiction, right, is the way that we can understand and establish the relationships that we have with one another. And so dialectical tensions, there's 5 core ones that I want to explore for today. And again, these are kind of contradictions. We want one thing and we also want the other. That is separation to integration, predictability to novelty, openness to closeness, similarity to difference, and ideal to real. So what I'm going to do is have us kind of break up into 5 different groups. I'm going to ask each group to look at one of these 5 dialectical tensions. And within your group, what I'd like you to do is you can write or type, everybody in your group. I'd like you to describe what the core contradiction is here between these 2 things. And then secondarily, provide an example of how this contradiction comes into play in a relationship. So as Baxter brought up, there's a contradiction between a relationship being the same, but also being different. And an example would be the context of renewing vows. So I'll kind of number you off and use that. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Focus on separation and integration. We'll have 1, 2, and 3. Focus on predictability versus novelty. We'll have 1, 2, and 3. Focus on openness versus closeness. We'll have 1, 2, and 3. Focus on similarity versus difference. And then we'll have 1, 2, 3, and 4 on ideal versus real. So take some time to chat with each other, figure out the core contradiction, and come up with an example of this contradiction.
Do you want one page per group?
1 per group is fine, yeah. I'd like each group to share the contradictions they noticed in this tension and then an example of this in action. So let's start with separation and integration.
You said that separation versus integration is the difference between sharing all of your life with somebody or sharing like none of your life. So that would be the 2 extremes. And you have to find a balance of like, well, we do these things together, but we have these interests separate.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like the way you described that, Jill, in terms of the way that we feel similarities with other people. We're oftentimes, again, birds of a feather, drawn to people like us, but we don't want to necessarily feel like we're totally enmeshed with them. We want some level of independence with that person. So there's a challenge there for sure. Predictability and novelty.
We said that, so the core contradiction is that predictability, that's like something in a relationship who might want to have things planned out, and just like, I don't know, not a lot of surprises. And then malleability would be like something like more spontaneous things. And so the example we came up with is if like you were a couple and you were going on a trip together, that like one person might want to have like an itinerary of the trip, like have it planned out of like places to go, places to eat, and then one person might just want to be like, no, let's not do that, let's just see what we like when we get down there.
Yeah.
And so that could be hard for each person to go either way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good example. My partner and I do the same thing, where it's like, I like having a list of where to go, and she's like, let's go to a random spot in town and just explore. So it's an interesting tension we deal with too. Openness and closeness.
I don't know if we did this right, but we said it's when some individuals are open and they don't do or try anything, whereas others are more closed off and like to be personal.
Yeah.
And then an example would be like one partner might want to go out and hang out and meet new people, but the partner might feel uncomfortable and not want to leave their own comfort.
Yeah. No, I think you definitely hit it there, because this tension deals with the idea that we are interested in sharing like the deeper levels of social penetration theory, right? But at the same time, we feel the challenges of opening up and don't necessarily want to show the entirety of who we are with other people, for sure. Similarity and difference.
You said if you kind of finish before similarities, common factors between one person and another. So the example of similarity is in which two people may have the same taste in music. Like Brenna and I like fairy tales. Similarity. Difference is in which two people may have contrast opinions in a relationship. An example could be like Steve and I's different tastes in music and stuff like that.
Music tastes is a really good example of this, right? We find a lot of commonalities. Oh, you like this band? I like this band. But also things where you get to branch out and learn new things that might be really good music too. Then lastly, ideal and real.
So we got like real is a term that displays originality, original, and ideal is something that is like suited for a certain purpose.
Yeah, yeah.
And then like ideal would be like a dreamer, like the person who dreams about it, like optimistic about life. And real is someone that doesn't dream but sees things more for what is reality.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe that, Trey. I like this sort of distinction of how things are versus how things could be, is a way of understanding this tension. So I really like the way that you all brought in some examples and applications here. I think you're definitely on the money in terms of describing these tensions. So just to kind of recap these, right? Separation and integration deals with the idea that people want to be together, but they don't want to sacrifice the entirety of who they are with other people. So, for instance, if there's concerns about, somebody coming across as clingy or codependent, that can be an issue of separation versus integration. We like finding people romantically who are similar to us, but we also might have friends that share differences from them, or might be things that we do other stuff with that is outside of the relationship too. So the fear of not sacrificing yourself entirely as a human is definitely one that we feel in the context of relationships. Predictability and novelty, right? So I feel like there's a lot of depictions of like couples who just are like sitting on the couch bored together and don't know what to talk about or say or do. And it's the idea, again, that people like patterns, they like security, they like having something like an itinerary, but they also don't like things to be boring. They don't like it to lose its novelty or interesting elements of it. So this challenge is definitely about how you make your communication with somebody else both safe and secure, but also allow it to be interesting, to be fun, to be engaging, so that it doesn't become the same old every single day. Openness and closeness, again, can go back to that onion analogy to describe social penetration theory. We want to be open and share who we are with other people, but we also choose to close off and not share everything. Because there might be details that are personal that we don't feel comfortable sharing yet, or there's just stuff that's not appropriate to share with another person. right? Even if you're really close and really comfortable with somebody, there's weird details that you're never gonna actually share with the other person, right? You're not gonna go to the bathroom and describe that experience to your partner, even if you're really close, right? There's things that you choose to close off and not share with somebody else. So if you've ever seen Frozen, or you had like a 6-year-old cousin who dragged you off to watch Frozen, similarity and difference is an example here. So in the beginning of this movie, right, there's the characters of Anna and Hans who seem very similar, right? And there's a whole musical number and bit at the beginning where they're talking about how similar they seem to be with each other, how in sync they are, they're finishing each other's sentences, blah, 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 right? And so that deals with this tension that we like people that are similar to us, that share, birds of a feather similarities. We also like the idea that in order to grow as people, there need to be some key differences between us and them too. The idea of music in the context of our relationships is a good one. You can have people that have a lot of tastes, but maybe expose you to new bands, to new music, and give you that experience that you otherwise would never have. So, listening to new bands, getting more context on them is really cool, right? Were it not for previous relationships, I would never have gotten to know many of my favorite bands, such as Spoon, Broken Bells, Violent Femmes, and so on. So the last one here, right, is this ideal versus real, and it's this question of a relationship being how you hope or desire for it to be versus how that relationship truly is, right? Again, it's that difference between how you want something to be versus how is something currently. One fear that some people bring up in the relationship is the idea that it doesn't seem like you like me, it seems like you like the concept of me. So a fear that gets brought up is that if a relationship with somebody else is put on a pedestal, or there's not an emphasis on understanding who that person is, that somebody doesn't feel heard or listened to. And on the other end, if somebody is totally realistic all the time, there might not be as much space for the relationship to grow. So these are challenges that we all kind of have to contend with in our relationships. So there's a lot of different approaches for dealing with some of these tensions, right? I'm going to kind of talk through these in a little bit. Denial, right, is, of course, saying that this tension doesn't exist. If you are desiring closeness and regular contact and somebody is only texting you every 2 or 3 days, you might be like, this is fine, I don't really mind this, even though you do want more regular contact. You're kind of giving up that as a thing that's important to you. Disorientation. So how many folks have heard the concept of cognitive dissonance? So a couple of you. So cognitive dissonance deals with the idea that when we feel like a contradiction or like hypocrisy in our head, then it physiologically, psychologically really makes us feel uncomfortable. For instance, if you're somebody that like always has reusable bags and is really focused on recycling everything, and you realize one day that you forgot it and you're checking out at the store with plastic bags, you feel cognitive dissonance because what you're doing is not consistent with how you want to be, right? In the same way, we feel cognitive dissonance or disorientation in terms of how we manage our relationships. We feel like, I want this feeling of closeness, but at the same time, I want space to breathe. So we might feel disoriented or uncomfortable about the fact that we want 2 different and kind of opposed things. One thing that helps a lot is that oftentimes, in general, when we're using sentences to describe our needs and wants, we'll use the word but to separate out ideas. So we'll say, I want to be close to somebody, but I want to be independent. An easy practice to help with managing these tensions is to use the word and instead of but. I want to be close, and I want to feel independence. And dealing with the disorientation that comes with wanting both of those things at the same time. Another idea is alternation. So that's moving between extremes in order to try to get both of them met. For instance, if you want both predictability and novelty, you might say, you know what, this week we're going to do our routine, We're gonna, go through all the normal stuff that we do day to day, but next week, we're gonna do a totally spontaneous trip to New York City, and we've got nothing on the agenda. So by alternating between those extremes, you might try to manage the tension that you feel. Recalibration, right, is adjusting the relationship based on the tension that you feel. So for instance, maybe you realize, hey, I don't feel like I'm talking to you enough. Can we up the amount that we talk to each other to 2 phone calls a week? Segmentation, right, is where you're separating out or compartmentalizing your approach. So you might be saying, you know what, sometimes we'll talk more regularly, but if it's a really busy week, we can agree to not talk as often. Balance is finding a middle space, right? Figuring out the place in the middle that works best for you. And recognizing that the middle looks very different for different people. If you're somebody that wants to text and communicate 20 times a day, and your partner wants to do it 5 times a day, maybe your solution is somewhere around 10 to 12. So depending on the needs between you and the other person, the balance could look a little bit different. Integration is considering the ways that both of the elements here can be used at the same time, right? So for instance, integration could be, you know what, we're going to keep our predictable routine, but we're going to add novelty by getting takeout at a new place every week and trying to mix things up a little bit. And then reaffirmation is the idea of doubling down on the commitments or the side of the issue that you see is really important. And that can be a make or break moment for a lot of relationships, right? Where you say and really reiterate, hey, I need to have regular communication and contact with somebody else. That's just the side of the issue that I follow. I need regular contact. So these kind of strategies are ways that we're really trying to deal with these tensions and issues as they come up in our own heads. Again, dealing with the cognitive dissonance or feeling of disconnect that we have between our actions and what it is that we want. And these aren't static either, because if we think back to Leslie Baxter and the idea that our relationships will change over time, our needs and wants will change a lot over time as well. So there's a lot of reasons that we might choose to self-disclose and share and become more open with other people in the context of our relationships, right? One trend that I found is really interesting on TikTok is more and more people, such as therapists, are using disclosures about their own mental health and mental health issues as a way of providing more resources and support. So for instance, therapists talk about their own struggles and challenges, ways that people can seek support, and so on. I think these are examples of how we use self-disclosure in relationships. We use it through expression. We want to be heard and seen and understood as full people. So we self-disclose for that reason. We use it to clarify. So for instance, if somebody has an invisible or intermittently visible disability, if somebody is LGBTQ+, but is coded in a heteronormative way, somebody is not white, but is white passing, people might clarify and say, no, I'm actually, my parents were born in Cuba. Social value is a reason to self-disclose. We see the relationships we have with other people is good in fulfilling our needs. It helps us to develop our relationships, again, to reduce uncertainty, to go toward more inner layers in social penetration theory. And social control and influence, right? It allows us to establish a relationship with other people. And it can be literal, right? Being an influencer on social media who's advertising something like, a meal plan and how it's worked well for them. That self-disclosure, hey, this worked great for me, is a way that people might choose to promote that brand overall. So there's some important distinctions that we can think about too in disclosure. Some of them deal with the type of relationship. Depending on the relationship you have with somebody else, the importance of disclosing could be really different. Things like duration and frequency play a really big role there, right? So if it's a friend you only see every couple of years when you go back in town, that's probably not going to be as much self-disclosure. We think about risks and benefits. Again, going to exchange theory, what potential benefit could we have if we share a really personal detail with our friends? One thing that I did in my own research, where I was interviewing folks who were both LGBTQ+ and autistic, was that many folks would kind of assess the terrain and figure out, is somebody comfortable about issues of disability or issues of gender and sexuality, and use that terrain in order to assess the risks and benefits that might come with outing and sharing their identities. The appropriateness of the situation is important too, right? There are just times where, if you're at a big social event like a party, you're not going to necessarily share really deep and personal details. And another key idea is this one of reciprocity. Again, relationships work best when they feel like a seesaw, that you're able to move the other direction and able to establish support with somebody else. Honesty, right, matters a lot. Depth, feeling like the relationship can move in a good direction and provide details. Having information available about the other person that makes you know what it is that you can choose to share with them. And the environment or context matters a lot too. Again, having a private conversation in somebody's home is very different than being at a big loud party and choosing to talk to them there. So our disclosure in our relationships really depends on a lot of these factors, and will be things that we look into even more after the break as we get into the role of friendships and the ways that friendship relationships can be developed. So there's a new trailer out for this next Spider-Man movie. And it seems like the central premise of this movie, right, is that Peter Parker's identity as Spider-Man has been discovered, and he wants to, undo that, right? When we watch, superhero films and TV shows, where there are characters who have this, hidden identity, we see a lot of alternatives to self-disclosure in action, right? This is a big example of this in play. One of the examples, right, is deception, where you're intentionally being misleading to somebody else, right? You're just sharing lies. Really good example of this is catfishing, right? Or Peter Parker saying, no, I'm not Spider-Man. Who is this guy? He seems weird, right? Equivocation, right, is where you don't directly answer the question, or you kind of deflect the issue. So you see this a lot whenever you see depictions of passive aggression. It's sort of like saying, hey, what do you think of my outfit? If somebody says, well, it is an outfit, right? That would be the use of equivocation. So, hey, are you Spider-Man? Look, what's that over there, right? Or the scenes where somebody is about to share something and then a big explosion happens and it cuts off the conversation would be an example of that too. And then hinting, right, is implying without directly saying, right? So it might be through the use of nonverbal communication and so on. So maybe you share, I'm going through a really rough time. Somebody reaches out and grabs your hand, right? That's a nonverbal way of hinting that, hey, I'm here to support you and help you out. So sometimes we think that we're disclosing to somebody else, and the other side is not doing the same, but we think they are through things like deception. Also, right, we can think about dating. And one of the key ideas here in terms of dating relationships, right, is the idea of a script. So we use scripts all the time, something like computer programming, right? A script is sort of a set behavior and action that happens consistently. So we oftentimes incorporate a lot of social scripts. One key example is, hi, how are you, right? We oftentimes use that exchange in the United States, not because we want an in-depth explanation of how the other person is doing, but because we want to initiate conversation with them. In dating, we might use scripts such as, doing things that might be courteous toward other people, splitting the bill, right? Or using something like an app to split a bill. There's a lot of script questions about who should pay or how things are paid that have changed a lot over time. There's scripts about, things like don't talk about an ex on a first date, and so on. So there's a lot of personal things we might choose to do or not do, or ways that we adapt to the situation. And that relates to the expectations we have. We'll use a first date to get to know one another better, for instance. The goals of the date with somebody else, right? What are they looking for? Are you looking for a serious relationship or a hookup? What elements of dating are kind of present? The idea that dating is dyadic, right? That it involves a dyad or conversation with other people. And also the role that our own kind of feelings play in these. We can think about these dialectical tensions earlier as an example of this too, right? In terms of openness versus closedness in dating. So for instance, for folks that might be polyamorous or ethically non-monogamous, one issue of openness versus closedness that comes out is a question of whether or not people can share details about other partners. So for instance, in some relationships, people say, I want to know everything about your other partners. Other people say, I don't want to know who they are. So openness versus closedness and those kinds of scripts can change a lot depending on the dating situation. So you don't need to know these unless it's kind of useful or interesting to you. But there's a lot of different styles that over time people have applied to understand love and relationships. These will be on the slides for after class, so you're definitely able to look back through those. But the idea here is that the way that we feel and express love can be really different depending on the person or the situation. Some feel love more in terms of closeness and kind of a psychological or mental space. Others really value the practical benefits. For instance, something like an arranged marriage that's common in a lot of cultures might be done in order for the practical benefits and gains to be felt, and so on. So again, you don't need to know these. These are just kind of a fun and interesting way that over time we've helped to establish different styles of relationships. And then the last idea that I want to hit on is the way that things such as gender and sexuality play into dating and relationships, right? There has been a lot of interesting research and some really cool stuff that's continuing to happen. At my previous institution, Utah Tech University, there's actually interpersonal communication professor who's really cool. Dr. James Stein, who does this podcast series called Red Rock Relationships, where he applies interpersonal communication to romantic and dating relationships. It has a lot of special guests and stuff. It's pretty cool. But there's a lot of kind of ongoing research and investigation into the role of gender and sexuality in dating. For instance, in places such as New Zealand, there's a lot of really unique conceptions of gender identity and ways that it's expressed and understood, So, for instance, the Maori indigenous culture includes a population that might engage, despite being assigned as male at birth, what might be considered to be more traditionally feminine activities, and there's an entire category to describe that. So there's a lot of differences in terms of how different cultures and attitudes might frame the ways that we understand the roles that gender and sexuality play into dating. And some of those different roles about gender, culture, sexuality, and so on are things that we'll be able to dive into in more detail after the break. So, to kind of wrap up what we've talked about for today, we've talked about the role that contradiction plays in our relationships through these different dialectical tensions. We want both of these things, even though they don't quite line up. We talked a little bit about self-disclosure and the ways that we choose to disclose in our relationships, and also dating, the ways that we see different scripts and narratives that emerge in our patterns of dating and relationships with other people. As a reminder, I'm not taking attendance on Friday, but you're welcome to show up if you want to answer questions about your essay, if you'd like just a space to work or anything else. I will be here and available to help you out. So that means that our next kind of full class session will be the Monday 29th after the Thanksgiving break. So if I don't see you again, have great and safe travel if you're traveling, or if you're staying home, a good chance to catch up on things. Please pass forward your group work for today. I'll see you on Friday or after the break. So have a great rest of your week. And best of luck as you're wrapping up the essay. Let me know if you need any additional support or troubleshooting.